so welcome everyone. Welcome to this event that is the last part of today's academic conference entitled Corruption, Tax Evasion and Institutions. My name is Nicolas Gavouai. I'm from SSE Riga and Biceps. And I'm very, very pleased to receive this evening as the second keynote of this event, Ruben Enikolopov, who is the rector of New Economic School, who is also affiliated with University of Pompeu Fabra. Ruben is co-editor of Journal of Comparative Economics. He is member of the editorial board of Review of Economic Studies, also of the Journal of the European Economic Association. Ruben has been working a lot on political economy, especially on issues related to medias and social media. This event also is the 2021 edition of the Alf Vanags Memorial Lecture. So Alf was the founder and the long-time director of Biceps, which is the institution organizing this event. This series of memorial lectures started back in 2017 thanks to the support of Charles Okealam. So we are having this fourth edition right now. So we are very happy in this respect to have Ruben presenting this evening, because Biceps and New Economic School are part of the same network of research institutions. So in between Sweden, Moscow, Riga, also in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Poland. So a broad research network in the region, in Belarus as well. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Ruben. So thanks again for participating. If you have any questions for the participants on Zoom, Ruben is welcoming every question, any questions on the way. If you have some questions on Facebook, you can post them under the live stream, and we will make a selection of them. So Ruben, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to participate in this conference, and I'm really honored that I was chosen to give this lecture in memory of Alf, who have very fun memories of him when we were having some collaborative meetings of New Economic School with Biceps and our partners at the Free Network. So really, it's a great honor to me to give the lecture in his memory. And today's lecture is basically it's our paper with my co-author Sergei Mityakov from Florida State University, in which we look at the tax evasion of politically connected firms. And to be more specific, we are looking at trying to understand the following questions. What is the value of political connections that are created by hiring government officials or their relatives? Mostly we'll be focusing on the government officials themselves. And here, there's a lot of, I mentioned some literature, there's a lot of already evidence on the importance of political connections for the firms when they have established connections with high-level politicians. For example, if they have high-level politicians on the boards of these companies, or as managers, some former like presidents, ministers, etc. So what we are slightly interested in is a difference. We are interested in the role of bureaucrats, so more like maybe like senior bureaucrats, but still not elected politicians, but people who work in the government at the more like standard bureaucratic roles and then join political firms. What happens when they establish new connections with the firms, how the behavior of the firms is changing and the outcomes of the firms. And the second like specific point on which we will be focusing, focusing especially on one outcome, which is tax evasion. And again, as I mentioned, talking about literature, there are plenty of works that document evidence on the effect of political connections on financial outcomes of the firms, on ability to get procurement contracts, etc., etc. However, there's actually not that much work on the ability of this of firms to use these political connections to get to achieve like more lenient enforcement of law, for example, through like tax collection. So and surprisingly to us, I think that this is to the best of my knowledge, first paper who really looks at the effect of political connections on tax evasion, at least the causal effect, which again, in some sense, I would guess that if you talk with people on the streets, not economists, academic economists, but people on the streets, and that's what will be the first thing that they expect political connections to help, like tax evasion will be definitely among the top 3 answers. So so this is the focus of our work, trying to actually establish whether there is this evidence on the effect of political connections on tax evasion. And as mentioned, the literature is already like pretty big, and it's still increasing, that looks at the effect of political connections and documented how valuable they are. However, there's certain particularities, for example, of identification approach, which have to do with the fact that establishing connections is an endogenous process. So we really want to have some quasi-exogenous variation in whether some firms have connections or not, because obviously firms who choose to have political connections, who are capable of attracting especially important politicians on their boards, they're by definition different, and they can be demonstrating better outcomes regardless of whether actually whether they have this political connection or not. So it may not be like a reflection of the causal effect, but of self-selection. And so in general, the literature uses several approaches to this. So one is a little bit sinister, but still supposedly random deaths of the politician. That was probably one of the most seminal papers in literature, Political Connections, by Ray Fissman on President Sukarno was coming from this. And there are several other papers that identify exactly this causal effect through the channel of deaths. However, again, this might be slightly different in terms of dynamic effects. If you think that establishing political connections is something that can survive the person who was at first trying to help establish this connection. So in some sense, that is political connection have long-term effects. This approach may lead to some underestimation of the effects, because even after the death, there's still firms with former political connection can perform better. On the other hand, actually, you might think that in case of deaths of, for example, big presidents like Suharto, you can overestimate the effect if after the death of one president, the firms that were connected with them, with the former president, get punished basically for the sake of of the firms that establish connections with the new president. So although this effect is indeed the death can be considered quasi-exogenous, still there can be some issues with this estimate as an unbiased estimate of political connections. With the elected politicians, it's slightly easier. You can actually estimate the effect of establishing connections using the quasi-exogenous variation coming from narrow election wins. So basically, it's the design that uses the regression discontinuity approaches to see that that firms that were connected to candidates that were running for election then get connections with the elected politicians just because these politicians actually won elections or slightly lost elections. Again, you can argue that this estimate is subject to the fact that you already looking on a subsample of companies that have connections, at least with political candidates who are running for elections. So it is a quite specific sample, but still within this sample, whether you win or not in this narrow election which is quasi-random, so it gives you a proper causal effect of political connection, at least for this subsample. So this is methodologically how people get where people get variation from. If we look at the channels through which companies may benefit from having political connections, there's a number of channels that were already identified in the literature as helping up the firms. First is professional access to financing, especially through bank financing, especially for government banks. That seems to be a huge boost to the firms if they have political connections. Another channel through which the political connection help firms is an increased likelihood of a bailout in case firms have some financial problems. And again, there's a growing body of evidence that this is really an important boost to the firms. Next, the third channel of how firms can benefit is the channel of preferential access, basically, to government contracts. Politically connected firms are more likely to have to win tenders for public procurement, and that is generally considered to be a very lucrative piece of contract. So that magically there's some firms really happy to win these contracts, and magically, if they have political connections, they're more likely to get these contracts, and that is an important channel. And finally, there's to the best of our knowledge, one paper look at lax enforcement of regulation as a channel from which firms can win. But this is a work by Fishman and Wong. But this looks at even more like darker side of law enforcement, because they look at safety regulations, especially for mining companies in China, and basically show that firms with political connections have more deaths of workers at the workplace, exactly because political connections then allow them to violate safety rules ex ante, and in the end, the cost of this political crisis is pretty huge, even in terms of deaths of workers. Although again, for firms, that allows them to make a lot of money. So we are, as I said, we'll be looking at something related to lax enforcement of regulation. Although to be not as dark, will be the price that tax evasion leads. Hopefully, is not measured in so many deaths as it is in the case of mining in China. So the context in which we are studying the effect of political connections on tax evasion will be connections with the Moscow government in the 1999-2003. So for like a brief history, a version of what was happening there, at that point in time, the Moscow government was headed by Mayor Yuri Lushkov. He was actually a mayor for 18 years, so it's right in the middle of his tenure as a Moscow mayor. It was a very highly politically influential person who was actually a presidential contender, serious contender in the election 2000. He was considered an alternative to Putin. But what he was also known is for the fact that his government was very often accused of corruption and embezzlement of funds during this period. In the, again, incidentally, for some magic reasons, he happened to be a husband of the wealthiest woman in Russia, Yelena Baturina, who I think still is the wealthiest woman in Russia, and magically he made most of her money in real estate construction in Moscow. So that was kind of what was going there in terms of the political connection helping at least some persons. So we want to establish more kind of universal effect of having connections with former workers of Moscow government on particular firms. Also, just in terms of since we'll be looking at the heterogeneity of the effects depending on the office from which the politicians are coming, just to basically the structure of the city government was that there was a main mayor office who was the central governing body for the executive branch. So this is basically like kind of president's suit. So this is the main level. Then one level lower were the departments of the mayor office. So they were more like specific. So this is Department of Finance, Budget Planning, Public Construction, etc. So they're still very high, like it's the top of the government, of the city government, but slightly below the main mayor office. Then Moscow was divided in 9 different areas that were headed by sub-governments called prefectures. So this is one level down, and even lower, there were more than 100 smaller units that were called upravas. So that was the 3rd tier. Well, 4th if you can count main, if you separate main and department offices. So we'll be looking at these 4 different tiers and how the effect depends on whether the cleric is coming from each of these offices. So, one of the reasons why we are looking at the effect at the data for 1999-2003 is because, well, this is a time period in which we expect, and the setting in which we expect political connections to matter, but another is the data availability, and namely there's at some point a very detailed administrative data became available exactly for this period, which was used in the previously used in the papers of my co-author Sergei Mitikov with his co-author Sergei Braginsky and Andrei Iskovich. And this is pretty amazing data, because what we have for this period is first is the employee-employer matched data sets. So we know for each person where they worked, if they were in social security system, which basically almost everyone who is working is there. So we know for each person, for each year, where they work for each firm, including if they work for public sector, for the government. So that basically allows us to establish who are government officials, because we can, like, they worked for the government. That's the definition. And then we know in which firms they work afterwards. Second, what we have is to have at an individual level the reported wages. Basically, it comes from tax office, so we know what was the official wage of each individual. And that is a very important piece of data, because basically, given the tax system of Russia at that time, one of the main ways for evading taxes was economizing on the taxes on wages by artificially lowering the wages. So that's actually what we'll be mostly looking at the report, like in terms of evasion for reported wages, and how they mismatch with the actual wealth of people. So how we measure the actual wealth of the people by we have also the data on the value of the cars owned by individuals. So for each individual, we know what the car that was registered under his or her name, and then again there's using the data on the prices of the cars, we can basically, given the name of the car, the year, etc., all the technical information, to infer the value of the car. And basically, we will be using as a measure of tax avoidance the mismatch between the two. Because again, in the previous works of Braginsky, Mitikov, etc., they established a functional form that knowing the value of the car, you can infer what is your actual wage, and then mismatch between the reported wage and actual wage will be the measure of tax evasion. And then we also use, we know that the names and legal addresses of residents of people to establish whether, to establish relatives and see whether having connections with relatives also help. We also, and on top of that, what we also have is all banking transactions, all legal entities in Russia for the same period. So it was also used in the work of Maxim Mironov, who was, I think, presented yesterday, and the works of Maxim with Katya Zhuravskaya. And that's again that will allow, what we use it for. We will know how much money different private firms get from public offices, especially Moscow government. So for us, that will be kind of a measure of winning public procurement contracts, how much money you directly get from Moscow government, and that will be like, as a one, will just show that this is one of the mechanisms of how firms benefit from political connections. So specifically, like what kind of measures we'll be using for political connections, what we do, we'll look again, as I said, because we have this matched employee data set, we'll be looking at the firms and see if among the people who work in this year in this firm, we have anyone who in the previous years worked for any city government office. Moreover, what we want to do is to look at in some sense, important government officials. So basically, we don't care if the janitor who used to work for Moscow city mayor moved to a private firm. We don't expect to see much there. So what we do is since we know the wages of the people, we construct for each government office, we construct a distribution of wages, and we take top 10% of people in terms of wages as kind of senior bureaucrats. So we define them as former top government officials, and see if these people move to a private firms, what happens with the outcomes for this firm. And we also try to do the same for the relatives of top government officials. So basically, for each government official, based on residency, we see if a person is a relative, and try to look if a relative of a government official comes to a firm, does it help or not? Okay, so the specification is pretty, I mean, in some sense, like the starting OLS specification is pretty simple, diff and diff, but with firm, so we have firm fixed effects and time fixed effects. If a government official comes, what happens to the outcomes of the firms? And the outcome, as I mentioned, will be the reported wages, the value of the cars that people have, and the mismatch between the two. So what we see here is that if we look at any former government official, meaning like anyone who worked for the government, we don't see much. There is some positive effect negative effect on the car values, but it's not very robust. But the situation is very different if you look at this top ex-government officials. So if really we throw away janitors and like people who are like very low in the ranking, if we look at people who are in this top percent of the wage distribution, which we define as top ex-government officials, for them the effect is pretty strong and very consistent. So what we see is that in the firms to which these government officials come, the reported income, the reported wages of employees of this firm. So here the unit of observation is just an employee. So it's if an employee in a firm with political connections has lower reported income, but at the same time the value of the cars they own magically goes up again. So if you combine the two, and we can construct this measure of transparency, the difference between the reported income and the actual income that we infer from car values, it's pretty clear that transparency goes down if we hire these top government officials. So the first set of results basically tells us pretty clearly that if you establish political connection with former city government officials, tax evasion in your firm increases and increases through both channels. So the actual wages go up, reported wages go down. So in the end, the effect is pretty big. What is also kind of encouraging is that also if you look at heterogeneity on the office, as I said, with the four tiers, you get what you expect. The higher up in the hierarchy of government is the office from which this government official is coming, the stronger is the effect. So the effect is strongest for government officials who come from the mayor office. It's slightly lower for departments. It's even lower for prefectures, and even lower for province. So that is at least coincides with the intuition that we have. But here, you still can argue that this simple difference in difference doesn't address the issue of indigeneity of the choice of political connections. So although it's already telling you, like, I mean, really, all the causal arguments apart. If you see that the transparency immediately after the government official comes to the firm, the tax evasion increases, it tells you something. Still, we're economists. We're trying to be very careful in causal arguments, etc. We're trying to come up with some even more detailed sources of variation to be absolutely sure about causal arguments. So what we try to do is to understand. To get at the probability of hiring government officials, looking at the kind of instance of some reorganizations in the government. So essentially, kind of the idea is the following: like, when are you more likely to hire top government official? Well, you're more likely to hire them if there are more top ex-government officials available. If there were some reorganizations, a lot of people were fired in a particular government office, they become available, you can hire them. But what we don't want so we actually don't know whether the person was fired or moved away voluntarily. So we need to understand really the cases in which there were like a lot of firings of the people in government offices. So what we do is actually we look at basically at the and we again another assumption that we think that the labor market is, although Moscow is kind of connected, it's one market still. If if a government official used to work in the same neighborhood of Moscow and they become available, you are more likely to hire them. So basically, they are more likely to move to a next employer who's approximately in the same region. So basically, we divide Moscow in zip codes, and in each zip code, we calculate the turnover of the government employees, how many of them were fired. But we look at people who are not below top 10%. So what we don't want to have is that, well, for some exogenous reason, all the top government officials go and start working. No, we want to have like, okay, so there was some reorganization, they were hiring a lot of people, firing a lot of people, and we're looking at this lower part of the distribution. But the fact that there were a lot of firings of lower rank people means that their superiors also are more likely to lose their job. Then they become available, and then firms are more likely to hire them. So that's kind of the intuition of the instrument that we have. We already have to have like some caveat, because even if you buy that it's exogenous and that like reorganizations are orthogonal to whether firms are more likely or less likely to involve in tax evasion, you should be worried about the local average treatment effect of basically, again, who we're identifying this, which firms. And here, basically the intuition is that we are identifying the effect from firms who, they were almost indifferent between hiring a government official or not. Just the fact that there are just recently more government officials made available by firing tip them into hiring them. So really, these are firms that if it's a firm that really wants to leverage political connections, definitely this is not the kind of firms that they were looking at. They will manage to find a government official even if they're not fired. So really, like for interpretation, we are looking at the firms that are kind of marginal in terms of their propensity to be to exploit political connections to start with. So in principle, that kind of intuitively we think that it's kind of gives us a kind of more like a lower bound on the political effect of political connections. So okay, so what we get, I will not go into details of how we do it, because it's like it's complicated 3-step Wooldridge style IV, because it's also because there's a nonlinear component involved, since the endogenous variable is binary. But these are technicalities. What we actually get is that all the results, at least they survive. Actually, they become stronger in some occasions. But the main conclusion is that all the results that we had they do not seem to be driven by homogeneity or the choice of political connections. They really is a causal pathway through political connections affecting tax evasion. But that is, for purists. Honestly, I think that even different results are pretty persuasive. But even if you are serious about endogeneity, you do this IV, all the results still hold. What is also interesting is the fact or trying to separate, look at the heterogeneity or the effect of different government officials. What are the characteristics of government officials that make political evasion lower or higher? And as I mentioned already, like one important source of heterogeneity is the office, like how important is a person coming, and there we got logical results. So another potential heterogeneity is that since we all have the data on cars and reported income, we can measure basically a tax evasion of a particular person. So on average, at least for the government officials. So for each government official, we can basically calculate kind of a personal tax evasion score as like what kind of car they own, if they own car, and what's the official wage and how different they are, and see whether there is any heterogeneity of the effect with respect to own tax evasion of the government officials. And what we see here is that indeed what we see in most of this region is that if you hire a government official who was more involved in tax evasion, him or herself, while working in the government, that increases tax evasion in the firms as well. So there seems to be, like, call it a skill or something, but there's some characteristics of politicians that they transfer with them. So if they were involved, like they were managed to get involved in tax evasion themselves while working in the government, they transfer their skills to the firms and they involved in tax evasion more themselves. So this is one kind of interesting piece that you can see here. But another thing is that if we want to slightly unpacked the mechanisms through which the effect on car values, because basically what it means, I mean, the interpretation, the fact that car values go up, is that actually, like, if a government official is hired, it's good for the firm in terms of how amount of money that they earn. Their real wages, like actual wages of the employees, go up. Well, they also lie to government and misreport official wages, and that is kind of understandable. But where's the mechanism why they actually earn more? And what we some evidence that we have, although here I admit it's not that strong, just because the estimates are pretty noisy, is that we do see that in this particular context, we confirm the results of the previous literature on the procurement channel. So basically, here we see that if you get the public officials, former government officials, the firms, after that, they receive more transfers from governments, like financial transfers, which probably, like, I mean, financial, we call them transfers because these are like just bank movements, but apparently these are payments for procurement services. So there is some evidence that these firms are more likely to have some funds coming from government, so to win some procurement contracts, and if they do it, the amount of this transfer is higher, although again, as I say, these are slightly non-robust, including for like fixed effects and in linear form, so it only works mostly works in this probability of having contracts or not. But still, there is some evidence that this is the procurement channel is the channel that explains why the actual real wages go up, and that reflects into value of the cars that people have. So and that is okay. So this is, again, just to show that, well, if you torture data enough with some nonlinear specification, that works. So there's some evidence that it goes. But another I think the very important piece of evidence is if we try to understand why the second channel, like the tax evasion, is, and how exactly why the firms with government officials on their staff can report lower wages. And in principle, you can think about several mechanisms. It can be the case that, for example, that these government officials, they have some knowledge about how to minimize wages and etc., the wage bills and etc., in a completely legal form, like through legal tax avoidance of taxes. That's one potential mechanism. Another can be that they have connections with tax offices. Although, again, for the sake of the record, the background is that tax offices in Russia, they are all at the federal level. So it cannot be the case that these used to be the subordinates of the government official, because this is actually one of the reasons why we look at the city government. In principle, we have results for federal government as well, but there it's more complicated because they can have direct connections with tax offices. So here, you know that there cannot be direct connections, direct subordinates of tax office, but still connections, personal connections, some other connections with the federal tax offices can be there. So they bring with them connections to these tax offices. And then basically these tax offices close do not check, for example, these firms when they misreport income. And potentially the third channel is like the enforcement channel, which is kind of even stronger than the previous one, because if you close eyes, it's kind of enforcement. That basically tax authorities, even when they know that the firm is doing something wrong and underpays taxes, they need to have like active action to force firms to pay. And we have some evidence on the role of this third channel, meaning that if we look at tax overdues, we see that the firms with political connections have higher level of tax overdues. What is tax overdue? Tax overdue means that the firm was checked by a tax authority. They realized that the firm has underpaid taxes, and still the firm doesn't pay taxes. So it's like really, it's not even like concealing the fact that that your wages are artificially lower. But then according to the books, officially you pay all your taxes. No, it looks like really like you don't even pay taxes that officially you supposed to do, that only on the wages that you have revealed as paying, you just don't pay them. So I think it's like my interpretation is it's a kind of evidence that that political connections give you protections from enforcement of regulation at the highest level, meaning that everything is transparent on the records. You owe taxes to the government, and you just don't do it. Which should be easy to solve in court because you have to be okay, but still they don't. This gives like some at least evidence what is the mechanism through which political connections help. So to wrap up and to leave at least some questions, I was trying, sorry again since I started late, I wanted to speed up a little bit to leave some room for questions. What we find in our work is that if you establish connections with former government officials, and importantly, unlike most of our work in the literature that existed, we're talking about bureaucrats. So this is just to stress how important the civil servants are and the bureaucrats are. Establishing these connections actually leads to an increase in tax evasion that comes from both an increase in actual compensation and a decrease in tax obligations, like being officially reported wages. And there is, again, it's shown in difference estimation. There is also some evidence that this is actually a causal effect if you use this fancy IV technique. So it's not purely driven by endogeneity. And interesting again that the effect is higher, like the heterogeneity is that it's higher, that the effect is higher if the government official, him or herself, were involved in tax evasion more while still working in the government. It's higher, the effect is higher if they're coming from more important levels of government, for like higher up levels of government. And also, sorry, I skipped for the sake of the time, the results that but this effects survive. So basically what we can see is that the person comes to the firm and then leaves the firm. Still, the level of tax evasion is remains at a higher level. So it's actually, it speaks to this literature on sudden deaths of political connections. Even if you establish connection and then you break connection, still the effect is there. So just looking at deaths is underestimates the effect of political connection. And so the effect of actual increase in compensation seems to be, at least one of the mechanisms, seems to be driven by higher probability of winning procurement contracts. But importantly, the effect on tax evasion seems to be very clearly, at least one of the effects is the lax tax enforcement. So that even when it's known that the firms are supposed to pay taxes, tax officials don't enforce this thing. So that seems to be a mechanism. Okay, so thanks a lot. This is our paper. So if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, and also very not so puzzling, unfortunately, results. So are there any questions from the audience? Just take the floor and so perhaps I can start then. I have many, but one that I have in mind, it's if I'm a firm myself and I'm operating in this context, let's say that I'm not very interested in legal compliance. One thing that I could consider is not to wait that the bureaucrat or the official is fired or just deciding to leave his or her job in order to join my company, but just to pay in advance, in a way, saying, as soon as you want, you join us. But in the meantime, as you still have right now some contacts, then you can already be useful to us. So a way to check that could be perhaps to use some sort of placebo. So to check so the timing of the change for the difference in differences, to move it backward and to see if the effect starts to take place or is visible before the actual switch from the bureau or from the office to the actual firm.
This is a great suggestion. We actually have just done it. We just done it yesterday. So I can share the screen with a Word document. So I didn't have time to put it in the presentation. But here are the results graphically. If you do it, and it's a mixture of like IV approach and different diff. So basically here we look at the firms in which at some point they can have this turnover that we use for IV, but we compare firms which in the end ended up hiring this political official or not, and we trace it before they come. Exactly. So here this the orange line is and we look here at the reported. We look at the reported incomes. So the orange line is the control group, and there, I mean, there's a clear trend, linear trend, because there's like inflation is going on pretty big at this time, so the wages are increasing constantly. If we look at the control group, it's pretty, there are no kinks. It's very linear. If we look at the treatment group, those who hire, and here it's again, they've normalized at period 0 is when they hire. The official, you see that before that, there's nothing, like no pre-trends. So they are very parallel and exactly the same. So that it doesn't seem to be the case like maybe they're not, either they're not as smart as you think to establish contracts before that, or nobody trusts anyone. So until I'm in the firm, I don't deliver anything. But once they are there, you clearly see that the wages. It's also important, I think, it's because if we look at the magnitudes of the effects, they're pretty huge. I mean, they seem to be realistic for people who lived in Russia at that time. So people were really under-reporting income big time. But part of it is you see, is not that they are after they come to the firm, they reduce nominal wages. Wages stop going up. But since there's a huge inflation, there's like the gap between treatment and control groups opens up, but only after they come to power. So that there don't seem to be any pretense.
So nothing happens before.
Yeah. So, and the same thing for the cars. It's also the same, but it's again here it's a bit more noisy, and you see that they're also delay, which also we think are very realistic. It's not that they come and the next year everyone is buying huge cars, luxury cars, and start driving. So it takes a couple of years. Well, first probably to earn this procurement contracts, because you start faking tax documents immediately, but then you have to win contracts to get the money, to accumulate them, to buy cars, etc. So I think it's realistic that we have a more delayed reaction in the cars, but it's still there.
Okay, just I have to mention that this was not coordinated. It's not something that we were discussing before, just to switch to the Word document right now. So, any other questions from the audience? Just take the floor.
So I missed the beginning of the presentation, but since
so did I.
I think I take advantage. So could you please maybe repeat how this piece of evidence fits into the literature on favoritism and political connections, and how it helps us go beyond the specific Russian case, perhaps.
Well, I mean, that's the question of external validity. Whether Russia is special is obviously a valid one. So I think, if you look at the context and background of the Russia at that time, also I think it's obviously not directly translatable to countries with really good institutions and really good law enforcement. So I wouldn't generalize it to there. But for mid-income countries, I think Russia at the beginning of 2000s was pretty representative case. In terms of, so I think in this generalizing, I think we'll learn quite a lot for mid-income countries. In terms of what is novel and how it fits the other literature, so I think that the two important parts that are novel. First is we really show that it's the bureaucrats, of different levels actually. They're rank and file. If you especially look at the not mayor office, but down lower down, not the big politicians like in most of the literature. Literature looks at connections with a really top politicians, members of the parliament, president, like the cabinet of ministers, etc. So even connections with low kind of rank and file bureaucrats helps already. I think that's important finding. And second, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's surprising to us that nobody ever looked at tax evasion, which seems to be one of the primary suspects of what happened, like what you get if you win political connections. So, there's some work that I mentioned, like lacks regulation, especially safety in China, but tax evasion, I think we have to the best of our knowledge, we have a first paper to show it, like there really causal effect, and that I think is very important because we can expect political connections to have a significant effect on on efforts to increase tax collection and increasing fiscal capacity, which again for mid-income countries is a very relevant issue, the issue of tax collection and tax capacity.
And this is somewhat related to the extent of enforcement, perhaps, or no. What? So yes. Is it like very precise information about what kind of violations get enforced or get prosecuted, and which ones do not, or what?
Yeah, so basically our effect on this tax overdues basically means that political connections help prevent enforcement of violations. So even the government knows that they are violating the law, they just don't enforce it. So in this respect, just to a very small one, do you have any data on audits? No, unfortunately not. That we would love to have. They don't know. So to check yes. The protective way you can avoid. Yes, that would be great. We would love it, but unfortunately, no, we don't have this data. I think Kalari has a question.
Thanks. I must say this is a fascinating data set, even without audit data, and I hope you're safe in using it and publishing this kind of results. One question I have, and I hope I simply didn't overlook or missed anything here, but I was wondering if you also have information on the ownership of the firm and whether you would have, whether there is any substantive difference between domestically owned and foreign owned firms in this context.
I will not switch to Word just not to seem like we are cheating, but yes, we definitely have this result, and they are perfectly aligned with our intuition. There's absolutely nothing for foreign firms. If they hire public officials, I mean, in some sense, it's puzzling for us. It's the other way around. If after they have government officials, they probably try to be like centered on Pope. So they actually for them they like tax evasion, even whatever. We don't actually. There's almost no evidence that there is tax evasion in foreign-owned firms in Russia at the period of time. But whatever it is goes down. Everything and nothing happens if there was already a government-owned firm. It's all driven by private firms. So yes, this is, I think this is also confirms with our intuition what was going on there, because foreign-owned firms in Russia, they were known that for not to be particularly involved in tax evasion.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please, Charles.
The question I wanted to pose, very interesting paper, two issues. One, how robust is that proxy, cars? Because you can envisage that in some countries, they're petrol heads and people buy cars. And in some instances, that's evident that they buy the cars. It's the first thing that they buy. It's the first thing that show evidence that they will spend money on that particular point of consumption. In some other countries, they'll buy something else. And I'm just wondering how robust cars are as a proxy. You might also think that it's a pretty obvious indicator that you've put your hands on some money. And if you were somebody who was benefiting from ill-gotten gains or not complying with tax, would you carry out fairly obvious behavior? And does that hold? So does this result, how applicable is this result across countries? Somebody raised a question about the transferability of the results, which is obviously difficult in empirical work, located in one country, but I pose the same question as well.
Yeah, I would separate the two things. I think the effect on tax evasion is pretty transportable. So I think it's generalizable. Whether the cars as a measure of tax evasion is generalizable, I completely agree that it's a much weaker argument, and I think it's less generalizable, not to all the context. So again, knowing the background, knowing like living in Russia at that time, I know that it is like people like cars are very elastic to your actual wages. So people like the first thing that you buy if you have money, car. Like there was an element of okay. you have to shop, and it's actually the previous works of my co-author were actually a little bit have to do with it, actually checking whether this is a good measure. And this is, I mean, to give you some intuition, some of this comes actually, for example, from these foreign-owned firms. So there, that they don't involve in tax evasion, and there the alignment between official wages and the car values is like ideal. This is what you expect. So people buy cars, the more they earn, the more they buy cars, but you can see that they can afford buying them with their wages. And it's like, so basically that's where comes this elasticity of how you transfer car value to wages that comes from the sample of foreign-owned firms, where we think there's almost no tax evasion. And then you generalize it, or then you look at Russian, like private firms in Russia, and then you see that the mismatch between official wage and the value of the car, it's pretty huge. But that, again, I completely agree that it was, in that context in Russia in the beginning of 2000, that worked. I'm not sure it's working even now in Russia, okay, at least because we know that public officials, they learned their lessons. So
exactly
that it will be my car. It's the car of my son, daughter, whatever, uncle, something.
A longer time series might show some different results.
Yes, but coming to the safety, I think I'm happy that we the date is pretty sensitive. So I'm happy that it's 20 years old.
Yeah. Oh yeah, of course.
So I prefer not to be engaged in a long-term study of tax evasion.
So technically, we are supposed to be running a bit out of time, but as the topic is super interesting, and I suppose that there are still a couple of questions at least, if that's okay for you, Ruben.
No, it's my mea culpa. I had this technical issue, so obviously I'm happy to answer questions.
So
if I can.
Yeah, Mihail. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I have two questions. One is, given that you identify particular persons, how big is the pool, for example, say, compared to the number of employees in these structures of Moscow government? Is it 1% or 3%?
The pool, sorry, just to be the pool of government employees, or
who switch to private and you identify them as corrupt?
So basically, if we look at, if you wait in the samples, units of observation for us is an employee in any firm. So for slightly more than 2%, 2.5% of them, they are working in a firm that had the government officials switching to them. So it's so we identifying this from the sample of approximately 2.5%, but it's a full sample of employees in Moscow. So the full sample is like millions of people. So well, in the end, after all the constraints that we have on ownership, etc., our sample size when we are looking at the employees is like approximately 750,000 people.
Okay, and the second question is: have you looked at another channel as these private firms having very, very good deals with Moscow government in terms of renting real estate?
We would love to have, we already have a lot of data, but there's some limits to what we have. I think that would be absolutely great, but unfortunately we don't have any information on what they're renting, how much they're paying for the real estate. So yes, that would be great. Because again, knowing the background of what's going on in Moscow at that time, we all know that actually this is what's happened. This privileged access to real estate owned by Moscow government almost for free. That was clearly like one of the channels. It's just we don't have data.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So I have this very small questions that you're showing that after an official moves to a firm, the value of contracts increases that they're getting, but so what's going on there? Can you tell us a little bit about, are they switching from the private sector demand, or or these are kind of complements that they are, getting more contracts, but and they are going away, right? So what does it tell us about the firm value?
Well, actually, honestly, we don't know, because we don't have the information at the value of at the level of contract. What we have is the amount of financial transfers from government entities to this firm. So basically for this year, we know that they received whatever, 1 million rubles from the government. Mm-hmm. We kind of, we assume that it's for public procurement, etc. But since the source of data are this data from bank movements from the Central Bank of Russia, this is the thing that Maxim Mironov and Katya Zhuravskaya are using. Well, the only thing that we know is amount of money, basically whether they get any money from the government as transfers, and the amount, and that's it. This is as much as we can get. But since there's no decrease in, we don't see any crowding out of private money. So it looks like it's on top. They're also getting something from the government.
I see.
So any additional questions? So in this case, I will reserve to myself the right to have a very last question. So if I understood correctly, you have two types of officials. You have the top officials, and you take also those that are in the top 10 of the wage distribution within the office, right?
No, it's sorry if I was not. It's the same. So we have all former government employees, and if we look at all, there's nothing. Yeah. But if we look among them, we'll look at those who are in the top 10% of wage distribution in the previous. There we see the effect.
Okay, yeah, no, I also misexpressed myself. But did you check if there is some sort of heterogeneity of, because I suppose some officials have more values than some others, depending on the type of office they are working in, depending on their own private connections and so on, so something that we cannot really see. But if they have different values, you can also imagine that they would have a very high salary, at least perhaps the official parts in their new position in the private sector. So depending on the differential between the new private and the previous public, if we take it as a proxy of the value that is brought to the new firm, would you also have some sort of heterogeneity?
Actually, this is a good point. I don't think we've done it. And we will be looking immediately on, it's also like at the official reported wage that they have in the new firm. So we still have to
after the type of car that they have just after they have a new job. Oh, that's good. I don't know, is it me having a connection problem, or is there anyone?
Yeah, I'm here.
We lost Ruben.
So it's Ruben. Okay, I thought it was from here.
Sorry, this is issue why I couldn't connect. It seems to be going on. I have something wrong with my internet. I'm really sorry about it.
Okay, so can you just repeat? So it was starting to cut at the very beginning of your
answer. So it's a great, like, we should definitely look at it. We haven't. Look at this effect. The one concern is that we can only look at the difference in reported wages, because for cars we have to, as you've seen, the cars kick in after like 1 or 2 years. So we have to wait a little bit. So it will be complicated. So we need to have probably as a measure, we can see like the car that they owned while in the office compared to the car that they own like 2 years after they're in the private sector, and then see how it's how it affects tax evasion. Yeah, we could probably do that as well. Yeah, but it's that's a good point. We should do that.
All right, so I think now we can say that this is the official ending of this both this keynote address and so this Alf Vanags Memorial Lecture 2021. So thank you very much for your participation. Thank you, Ruben, for this extremely interesting address. We would like to thank also the Latvian Science Academy, which funded this overall program. This conference is part of the output of this program. The name of the program was Institution and Tax Evasion and Tax Enforcement in Latvia. So we are grateful for this support. And thank you very much, everyone, and hope to see you in Riga in real life on site anytime soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation.